Sera Voss was running in her wedding dress with her shoes in her left hand and a small bag against her right hip when she heard the footsteps at the end of the corridor, and she understood from the sound of them the particular weight and pace of a man who was not hurrying because he did not need to hurry, that she had miscalculated the window by approximately 4 minutes. She stopped, not because she was giving up, but because running from this particular sound was not the same calculation as running from the alternatives, and she needed 3 seconds to determine whether the door at the far end of the west corridor was still the better option. It was not. The man whose footsteps she recognized without seeing him had already reached the junction that cut off the west corridor from the servants' stairs, which was the only route she had identified that did not pass through a camera position, and the door at the far end led to a utility area that required a code she did not have. She turned around. Vincent Marlow was standing at the junction with his jacket still on and his hands in his pockets, which was the posture of a man who had not been surprised and was not performing the appearance of calm because he did not need to perform it. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was holding her shoes in one hand, which was not how she had imagined being found, but the shoes had been a practical decision, and she was not going to apologize for practical decisions. "The ceremony is in 4 minutes," he said. His voice was what she had expected from the 2 brief meetings that had preceded this evening, which was low and even and not interested in making anything easier. She had spent those 2 meetings measuring him the way she measured every room she walked into, which was by identifying the load-bearing walls and the exits, and what she had concluded about Vincent Marlow was that he was someone who had spent a long time being the most dangerous thing in every room he entered and had stopped needing to announce it. What she had not concluded was that he was predictable, and the fact that he was standing in this corridor with that expression rather than in the ante-room where the officiant was presumably waiting told her that unpredictability was not limited to her. "I know," she said, which was all she had. He looked at the shoes she was holding, and then at the bag against her hip, and then at her face, and the quality of that inventory was not angry, and was not amused, and was something more specific than either, which was the quality of a man cataloging information and revising a model in real time. "Come with me," he said, and turned and walked back the way he had come, and she stood in the corridor for a moment holding her shoes and making the calculation, which took less time than it should have because the alternatives to following him were narrower than they had been 3 minutes ago, and then she put her shoes on and followed. He took her to the room she had been given to prepare in, which was large and south-facing and had been filled with flowers that she had not requested, and which now seemed like the decorative assertion of an occasion she had not agreed to. He closed the door behind her, and she heard the lock, and the sound of the lock was not particularly loud, but it occupied the room in the way that significant sounds did, and she stood in the middle of the room with her bag still against her hip and looked at him and waited for the version of this conversation she had been preparing for, which was the version that involved the display of authority that men in his position tended to produce when they were making a point about who controlled a situation. He did not produce that version. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the glass and looked at her, and the silence lasted long enough that she understood it was deliberate, and that the deliberateness was its own kind of message, which was that he was waiting for her to fill it. She did not fill it. She set her bag on the chair near the vanity and sat down on the edge of the small settee, because standing in a room with someone who was not going to sit down was a posture she had learned to avoid. He looked at the bag. He looked at her. He said, "You're my wife now." She held the sentence for a moment the way you held something that was both true and not yet entirely real. Then she said, "I know." He waited. She said, "Ask me the question you actually want to ask." He was quiet for a moment that told her she had surprised him without telling her how much. Then he said, "Where were you going?" She looked at the window behind him and made a decision that was not about trust but about information. "Somewhere your people wouldn't have found me before morning," she said, and then from there, "Somewhere your people wouldn't have found me at all." He held her gaze. "Alone," he said. "Yes," she said. "Why?" he said, which was the question she had been deciding how to answer since 4 days ago when the last piece of what Daniel had arranged became clear enough to act on. She looked at him and measured the room and the lock and the man in front of it and said, "I need to ask you something first. About my father's debt to your family." Something moved in his expression, brief and specific. The movement of a man who has been handed the corner of something larger and is deciding whether to pull it. "What about it?" he said. She said, "When was it paid?" He was still for a moment. Then he said, "That's not the question I expected." "I know," she said. "When was it paid?" He looked at her for a long time, in the way of someone who is deciding whether the question being asked is the question that's actually being asked, and she held his gaze and did not offer him anything additional, because additional information at this stage would change the shape of what he told her, and she needed the unmodified version. "Why do you want to know?" he said. "Because the answer determines whether I have the conversation I was planning to have, or a different one," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, 7 years ago." The room was quiet. She looked at the flowers on the table across from her and thought about 7 years and what they meant in the context of everything else, and the picture that assembled itself in her mind was cleaner and more specific than the one she had been working with, and significantly worse. She looked back at Vincent Marlow. She said, "I see." He said, "Do you?" She said, "Not completely, but more than I did." He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, not the chair near the vanity where her bag was, but the one closer to her, and the sitting down had the quality of a decision rather than a convenience. He said, "Tell me what you were running from." She looked at the locked door, and then at the man sitting across from her, and made the partial decision that was available to her, which was not the full account, but the beginning of one. She said, "My brother arranged this marriage." He said, "I know. I negotiated with him." She said, "Did you negotiate with him, or did he negotiate with you?" The distinction in phrasing was slight, and he heard it precisely, which she could see from the way his attention shifted. She said, "I'm not asking what the terms were. I'm asking whose terms they were." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Continue." She said, "I'll tell you more after the ceremony, not before." He looked at the locked door and then at her, and the quality of that look was not what she had expected either, which was the look of a man recalibrating rather than a man deciding whether to force something. Then he stood, and he went to the door, and he unlocked it, and he held it open. He said, "The officiant is waiting." She stood. She picked up her bag and put it on the chair and left it there, which was a decision about what she was committing to right now and what she was not, and she walked past him through the open door and into the corridor that led to the room where 200 people were waiting to witness something that none of them understood the full architecture of, including the 2 people about to stand at the center of it. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes and was conducted by an officiant who had the practiced neutrality of a man who had performed ceremonies in rooms with this particular quality of tension before and had learned that the correct response, too, it was precision rather than warmth. Sera stood at the front of the room beside a man she had met twice and had been running from 20 minutes ago and read her vows from a card that someone had prepared, without asking her, in a voice that was level because she had decided it would be level, and not because she was calm. When it was done, she felt the ring on her finger and felt the weight of it as information rather than sentiment. The way all things of significance landed with her, not as feeling but as fact that feeling would come later to inhabit. Vincent read his vows without looking away, which was the first thing he had done that she had not expected and that she could not immediately explain, and she noted it and did not look away either, because looking away would have been the performance of someone who was overwhelmed, and she was not overwhelmed. She was calculating. They were the same thing, from the outside, and she had lived long enough in rooms where the outside was the only thing that mattered to know the difference. The reception lasted 3 hours and was attended by 140 people who ate well and drank well and watched the bride and groom with the particular attentiveness of people who understood that what they were witnessing was not primarily a celebration but a ratification, the visible confirmation of an agreement whose terms they were not privy to, but whose significance they could measure by the quality of the wine and the guest list, and the way Daniel Voss moved through the room with the ease of someone who had just completed something rather than someone who was celebrating something. Sera tracked her brother from across the room for the duration of the evening with the peripheral attentiveness she had developed over years of navigating spaces where what was visible and what was true were separate categories. He shook hands with the correct people. He laughed at the correct moments. He touched her arm once, briefly, near the beginning of the evening, and said, "You look wonderful," in the tone of a man delivering a line he had rehearsed, and she smiled and said thank you, and noted that his hand on her arm had the pressure of someone making sure she was still there. Vincent spent the first hour of the reception performing the social function of a man at his own wedding with the efficiency of someone completing a necessary process, which was to say he was present and responsive and gave nothing away. And Sera spent that same hour watching him the way she watched everything, which was from the corner of her attention while the rest of it appeared to be elsewhere. What she saw was a man who was also watching, not her specifically, but the room, and within the room her brother specifically, and the quality of that watching was not the watching of someone who had noticed something and was curious, but the watching of someone who had noticed something and was verifying a calculation. At one point, approximately 40 minutes into the reception, Daniel said something into Vincent's ear that lasted no more than 5 seconds, and Vincent's expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a very small adjustment in the set of his shoulders that she would not have noticed if she had not been looking for exactly that kind of adjustment, and she noted it and continued her conversation with the woman to her left about something she was not tracking. When the reception ended and the last guests had expressed the correct sentiments and been escorted to the correct transportation, the house settled into the particular quality of quiet that large houses achieved after large gatherings, the quiet of a space exhaling. A staff member showed them to the suite that had been prepared, which was on the second floor and faced the garden, and closed the door behind them with the discretion of someone who had been briefed on what kind of evening this was. Sera sat down on the edge of the window seat and looked at the garden below, which was lit in the way of gardens that were meant to be seen from above, and waited. Vincent took off his jacket and put it over the back of the chair by the writing desk and stood in the middle of the room with his sleeves rolled down and his collar still buttoned, which was the posture of a man who had not yet decided what posture to adopt, and she found that more interesting than any posture he might have deliberately chosen. He said, "You said you would tell me more after the ceremony." She turned from the window and looked at him. "I said I would tell you more," she said. "Not everything." He held that for a moment. He said, "What did your brother say to you at the beginning of the evening?" She said, "He told me I looked wonderful." He said, "What else?" She looked at him. She said, "What did he say to you?" 40 minutes in, near the bar. He was quiet. She said, "I saw your shoulders move." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to identify as the one he used when he was adjusting his model of her, which was not a comfortable expression to be the subject of, but was at least an honest one. He said, "He told me that he hoped I understood what I had taken on." She held that. She said, "And what did you understand from it?" He said, "At the time, I understood it as the statement of a man who was uncertain about his sister's temperament." He paused. "Now I understand it differently." She looked at the garden and said, "My brother has been managing the Voss family interests for 6 years, since our father died. He has managed them well by certain measures and poorly by others." She paused. "The measure by which he has managed them most poorly is the one that concerns the long-term structural integrity of the family's position, which requires decisions he has consistently deferred in favor of decisions that consolidate his own control in the short term." Vincent sat down in the chair by the writing desk, not because the chair was convenient, but because the conversation had reached a register that required sitting. He said, "And you?" She said, "I have been watching him defer those decisions for 6 years and making, where I could, the decisions he was not making, through channels that didn't require his approval. Successfully, in most cases." She looked at him. "I think you may already know this," he said. I have information that suggests it. I don't have confirmation. She said, consider it confirmed. Then she said, the reason I was running tonight was not what you thought it was. He said, I know. She said, what did you think it was? He said, I thought you were afraid of me. She said, I was not afraid of you. He said, I know that now. She looked at the ring on her finger and then at him. My brother did not arrange this marriage to secure the Voss family's position, she said. He arranged it because it removes me from the position I have been occupying and places me in a position where I am visible and therefore predictable, and where anything that happens to me can be attributed to the circumstances of the marriage rather than to him. The room was very quiet. Vincent looked at his hands for a moment, which she had not seen him do before, and when he looked up there was something in his expression that was different from all the other expressions she had catalogued from him, something that had the quality of a man arriving at a place he had been moving toward without being certain he was reading the terrain correctly. He said, How much do you know about what he has arranged outside of this marriage? She said, Not enough, but enough to know that tonight was a date rather than a destination. He was quiet for a long time. She let the quiet be what it was, because pressing it would have been the wrong instinct. Then he said, He told me, tonight, near the bar, that he hoped I understood that the Voss family's commitment to this agreement was total. She looked at him. She said, He has never in his life made a commitment he did not intend to exit. Vincent looked at the door of the room. Not the way someone looked at a door they intended to use, but the way someone looked at a door they were thinking about what was on the other side of it. He said, Get some sleep. She said, You believe me? He looked at her. He said, I believe you are telling me what you know. She said, That's different from believing me. He said, Yes. She said, Which is it? He said, Both, right now. She looked at the window and the garden beyond it and considered that, and found that both was more than she had expected, and also exactly the correct amount for the current state of available information, and that it was possible to build on both, in a way that it was not possible to build on certainty that had not yet been earned. She lay down on the side of the bed nearest the window, in her clothes, because the dress was gone and she had changed into something practical during the reception, and she looked at the ceiling and listened to Vincent move to the writing desk and open his laptop, and the sound of the laptop opening was the most ordinary sound she had heard all evening, and it was that ordinariness, more than anything else about the night, that let her close her eyes. The Marlow house in the first week of their marriage had the quality of a space adjusting to a new variable, not unwillingly but carefully, the way a well-maintained system incorporated a change by first understanding where the change fit and where it created friction. The staff were professional in the specific way of staff who had worked for Vincent Marlow long enough to have calibrated their behavior to his preferences without being asked, which meant they were efficient and unobtrusive, and gave Sera the particular quality of space that came from people who were waiting to understand what she required before offering it. She did not require much, which she communicated through the ordinary means of daily routine, and by the third day they had settled into a working relationship that was functional and not warm and suited her well. What she was learning about the house, she was learning the way she learned most spaces, which was by moving through them with attention and recording what they told her about the person who had built the life inside them. Vincent Marlow's house told her several things. It told her that he had been living alone for long enough that the space had organized itself entirely around one person's habits. It told her that the habits in question were disciplined without being rigid, which was a distinction she had learned to make about people who had been in environments that required self-regulation over long periods of time. It told her that the library on the second floor was used rather than displayed, which she determined on the second morning when she found a cup on the end table that still had warmth in it, and a marker in a book she had not put there, and which told her he had been there in the early hours before she was awake, which told her something additional about the way he used solitude. She did not enter the library when he was in it for the first 4 days, because the library was clearly a space he used for a particular quality of thinking, and she was still mapping the geography of his preferences. On the 5th morning she found him there at 7, reading, and he did not look up immediately when she came in, which she interpreted not as a failure to notice, but as the particular acknowledgement that came from someone comfortable enough with a presence to not perform the acknowledgement of it. She sat down on the other end of the room with a document she had been working through, and they spent an hour in the library together without speaking, which was the most natural hour she had spent in any room since arriving. It was during that hour that he said, without looking up from his book, "The Voss family holding in the coastal logistics corridor. Tell me about it." She looked up. She said, "What do you already know?" He said, "I know it was assessed 3 years ago by an external firm and found to be underperforming relative to comparable assets." She said, "I know who commissioned that assessment." He looked up. She said, "It was commissioned through a shell company that traces back, 3 steps out, to a firm that Daniel has used for competing interests since our father's estate was settled." He was quiet. She said, "The assessment was designed to suppress the valuation. The asset has been outperforming comparable assets since the reassignment of the management contract 2 years ago." He said, "Who reassigned the management contract?" She said, "I did, through a channel that Daniel doesn't monitor because he doesn't know it exists." He held her gaze for a moment. He said, "How many of those channels are there?" She said, "Enough." He went back to his book. She went back to her document. After another 20 minutes, he said, "You've been building a parallel structure inside the Voss family holdings." She said, "I've been maintaining the parts of the Voss family holdings that Daniel was allowing to deteriorate." He said, "Those are different characterizations of the same activity." She said, "Yes." He said, "Which one is accurate?" She said, "Both, depending on who is being asked and why." He closed his book and looked at her across the room with the full quality of attention that she had been on the receiving end of several times now, and which she had concluded was the most useful thing about him, which was that it was actually full. It did not perform fullness while thinking about something else. He said, "Your father trusted Daniel." She said, "My father trusted the structure more than the people inside it. He believed that if the structure was correct, the people would follow. He was wrong about that." He said, "And you?" She said, "My father trusted me to do what I was told, which I did, and to not exceed what I was told, which I also did, as long as what I was told produced a result I could defend. When it stopped producing a result I could defend, I stopped doing what I was told and started doing what was necessary." He looked at his book and then at her and said, "That is a precise and useful distinction." She said, "I have had 6 years to refine it." She received the message on the 6th day, on a device that was not her primary phone, a small secondary handset that she kept in the lining of a bag she had brought to the house, and which used a number registered to a name that was not hers. The message was 4 words. Timeline moved. "This week." She read it twice, and turned the phone off and sat with it in her hands in the bathroom with the door closed, and thought about what this week meant in the context of what she knew and what she did not know, which was still too large a proportion of the whole. She knew that Daniel had an arrangement outside the Voss-Marlow agreement. She knew the arrangement involved a third party whose interest was destabilization rather than acquisition, which was the kind of interest that required a triggering event rather than a process. She knew that she was positioned, in Daniel's plan, as the most likely source of a triggering event in this house in this week, and she did not know precisely what form the event was supposed to take, which meant she did not know what she was supposed to do or not do to avoid becoming the mechanism of it. This was the specific shape of the problem, and it was the shape she had been carrying since before the wedding, and it had not gotten smaller in the days since. It had only gotten closer. She turned the phone back on and deleted the message and put it back in the bag lining, and went downstairs and found Vincent in the study adjacent to the library, and she stood in the doorway and said, "I need to tell you something I haven't told you yet." He looked up from whatever he was reading. He said, "I know." She said, "You don't know what it is." He said, "No, but I know there is something." She said, "How long?" He said, "Since the first night. You gave me pieces. There is a piece you have not given me." She came in and sat down and looked at the desk between them and said, "My brother has a secondary arrangement, outside the agreement with you. I don't know who the other party is. I know the intended outcome is a destabilizing event in this house in the near term, and I know I am intended to be the mechanism of it in some way that I have not been able to fully map." She paused. "And I received information today that the timeline has moved forward to this week." The room was quiet. Vincent looked at the desk surface, and then at her, and said, "What kind of event?" She said, "The kind that produces a credible breach of the Marlow-Voss agreement." He was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I don't know the specific mechanism. I have been trying to determine it since before the wedding." He said, "That's why you were running." She said, "Not to escape, to eliminate the mechanism by removing myself from it." He looked at her. He said, "That would not have worked." She said, "I know that now. I suspected it then." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because if I'm the mechanism and I'm not available, he finds another mechanism, and I have no visibility on what the other mechanism would be." He said, "So you stayed." She looked at the doorway she had come through. She said, "I stayed because the door was locked." He said, "And if it hadn't been?" She looked at him. She said, "I don't know. I've been asking myself that since the ceremony." He held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, "I have a meeting in the morning. Do not change anything about how you move through this house until after that meeting." She said, "What is the meeting?" He said, "Information I should have had before this week." She said, "From inside the Voss family." He did not confirm it. He did not need to. She nodded and stood and went back upstairs, and in the hallway outside the library, she stopped for a moment and looked at the door at the end of the hall that led back to the stairs, and thought about the night she had calculated that door as an exit, and then she went to the library and opened the book she had been reading that morning, and read without retaining much, and waited for morning. The meeting ended at 10:40 in the morning, and Vincent came to find her in the library at 10:53, which she knew because she had been watching the clock for the past 2 hours with the specific attention of someone waiting for information that will change the shape of everything currently known. He came in and closed the door, and did not sit down immediately, which told her that what he had received required standing for at least part of the delivery. She closed her book. She put it on the table and turned in the chair to face him and waited, because she had learned that pressing him at the threshold of information was the wrong instinct, and that he would organize what he had to say in the order that made it most accurate, which was the order she needed it in. He stood at the window for a moment and looked at the garden, and then he turned and sat down in the chair across from her and said, "The name of Daniel's other party is Gregor Fell." She held the name. She said, "I know that name." He said, "I thought you might." She said, "He was present at my father's funeral. He was positioned as a business associate. He and Daniel spent 40 minutes in my father's study during the reception that followed the funeral. I noted it at the time and filed it, and did not yet have enough to do anything with it." Vincent said, "Daniel has been in communication with Fell's organization since 3 months after your father's death. The arrangement was structured around a specific outcome. The Marlow-Voss agreement to be voided on grounds of material breach, with the breach to be attributed to conduct originating from within the Marlow household in the first 30 days of the marriage." She sat very still. She said, "Material breach," he said. "Specifically, a breach that would trigger the rescission clause in the agreement, which would revert control of the Voss coastal holdings to the Voss family under the terms of the original compact." She said, "And then," he said, "and then Fell's organization acquires those holdings from the Voss family at a valuation that reflects the suppressed assessment from 3 years ago. She sat with the full structure of it for a moment, assembling the pieces she had been holding separately into the shape they had always been meant to make. The suppressed valuation, the managed assessment, the timed marriage, the triggering event. She said, "What is the mechanism for the breach?" He looked at her. He said, "You." She said, "Specifically." He said, "A document, signed in your name, evidencing a transfer of information from within the Marlow operation to a competitor, predated to the 3rd week of the marriage." She was quiet. She said, "A forgery." He said, "A very good forgery. Prepared in advance." She said, "How do you know this?" He said, "My source in the Voss family. Someone who has been watching Daniel since before the wedding and who came to me this morning because the timeline moved and the document is now in Daniel's possession, ready to be introduced." She looked at the window. She said, "Your source." He said, "Someone who understood what Daniel was doing before I did, and who understood, also before I did, that you were not part of it." She looked at him. She said, "You thought I was part of it." He held her gaze. He said, "I considered the possibility until the first night." She said, "And after the first night?" He said, "I considered it less." She said, "That's not the same as dismissing it." He said, "No, it's not." She held that without comment, because it was accurate, and because commenting would have converted it into something that required resolution rather than something that could simply be true. She said, "What does the document say?" "Specifically," he said, "it purports to show that you provided Fell's organization with operational details about 2 Marlow distribution routes in exchange for a financial arrangement." She looked at the book on the table, and then at him. She said, "That's detailed enough to be credible and vague enough to be deniable in the long term." He said, "Yes, it is designed to produce an immediate breach, and then a protracted dispute. The protracted dispute is useful to Fell because it occupies Marlow resources while the acquisition proceeds." She said, "Smart." He said, "Yes." She said, "Daniel is not smart enough to have structured this alone." He said, "No, he provided the access. Fell provided the architecture." She said, "How long have you known about Fell?" He looked at the window. He said, "I suspected a third party from the day Daniel proposed the structure of the agreement. The terms were too favorable to him in ways that didn't map to his actual leverage. I accepted the agreement because the terms were favorable to me as well, and because I wanted visibility into what he was doing." She said, "You used the agreement to get visibility." He said, "Yes." She said, "And me." He said, "You were not part of the calculation at that stage." She said, "And now?" He looked at her and said, "Now you are the center of it." She stood up and walked to the window and stood beside him and looked at the garden and thought about the center of things and what it required. She said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Everything you have. Every channel you built inside the Voss holdings. Every suppressed record you have documentation of. The management reassignment. The coastal corridor." She said, "You want to use it?" He said, "I want us to use it. There is a difference." She looked at him. She said, "You could have asked me for this from the beginning." He said, "I didn't know you had it from the beginning." She said, "You suspected I had something." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you didn't ask?" He said, "Because I didn't know if you were part of it." The sentence sat between them. She had heard it the night before, and she heard it now, and she understood it both times as the same thing, which was the honest accounting of a man who had operated in a world where the cost of misplaced trust was high enough that not trusting was a form of professional competence rather than a personal failing. She understood it. She did not find it without cost. He went to the desk and opened the drawer and put a document on the table between them, and she looked at it. It was a settlement record. It was dated 7 years ago. It showed the full discharge of the Voss family obligation to the Marlow family in the amount that her father had owed and with the signature of a Marlow family representative she recognized as Vincent's father. The debt was gone, had been gone for 7 years. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "Daniel told you the debt was still active." He said, "Daniel told me the debt was the basis of the agreement." She said, "And you knew it wasn't." He said, "I have known for 7 years that it was settled." She said, "Then why?" He said, "Because the Voss family without your father is a structure that is losing integrity, and because the person inside it who understands how to maintain that integrity has been systematically excluded from the authority to do so, and because your father and my father made an agreement 17 years ago that had nothing to do with debt and everything to do with the understanding that what one family built alone they might not be able to preserve, alone." She looked at the settlement document and then at him. She said, "You married me because you believed I was the right person to hold the Voss family together." He said, "I married you because the evidence of your decisions over 6 years suggested you were the only person who could." She said, "You should have told me this." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" He looked at her and said what she had been waiting for, the sentence that held the weight of everything he had not said in the corridor, and the locked room, and the first night, and the library, and all the days between, "Because I didn't know if you were part of it." She looked at the document on the table. She looked at the window. She said, "Call your lawyers." He said, "Already." She said, "What do you need from me in the next 4 hours?" He said, "Sign nothing, move nothing, continue exactly as you have been moving through this house, and tell me the name of every channel you built in the Voss holdings." She looked at him and made the full decision, not the partial one she had been making for 7 days, but the complete one, and she said, "Sit down." He sat. She started talking. What they built in the 4 hours that followed was not elegant, and was not the kind of thing that would be described later with any narrative tidiness, because the actual work of dismantling something that had been carefully constructed over 6 years by a man who had spent those 6 years learning the specific vulnerabilities of the people around him was not tidy. It was granular and specific, and required Sera to access channels through devices and accounts that she had kept compartmentalized for good reasons, and it required Vincent to place calls to 3 people she did not know, and to share information with them that he had been holding in the same way she had been holding hers, which was carefully and in separate containers, so that the loss of one container did not compromise the others. They worked at the desk in his study with the door closed and 2 laptops open and a legal pad between them on which she wrote names and routing structures in the shorthand she had developed for exactly this kind of documentation. And he translated those names and structures into the language his lawyers needed to work with, and the lawyers worked from their offices on the other side of the city with the speed of people who had been briefed that time was the operative constraint. By 2 in the afternoon they had assembled what they needed, which was not a counterattack but a preemption, which was a better posture and Sera's instinct from the beginning. The preemption worked because it was delivered to the correct people before Daniel could introduce the forged document. The correct people were the 3 members of the Voss Family Oversight Committee who were not aware of Daniel's secondary arrangement and who, when presented simultaneously with the documentary evidence of what Daniel had structured with Fell and the documentation of Fell's acquisition plan for the coastal holdings, understood immediately that what Daniel had built was not a strategy for the Voss family but a strategy against it, using the Voss family's own assets as the instrument. They convened an emergency session that afternoon at which Daniel was not present, and at which the motion to suspend his executive authority pending a full audit of his decisions since their father's death passed 4-1, the one dissenting vote being a board member who abstained rather than voted no, which was the dissent of someone who knew which way the ground was moving and was managing their own position rather than defending Daniel's. Sera received the notification of the vote from Vincent's source inside the family, who she had by this point identified as the same person who had sent her the 4-word message about the timeline, a person she had suspected for some time, and who she made a note to speak with directly when the immediate situation had settled. Vincent received the notification from his lawyers. They were in the study when both notifications arrived, and they read them separately and looked at each other across the desk, and the quality of that look was not triumph, because neither of them had the temperament for triumph as a primary emotion, but was something more specific and more useful, which was the look of two people who had bet on the same outcome, using different information, and found that the information was compatible. Daniel did not contest the vote. That was the part that Sera had not predicted with certainty, because she had constructed several models for how he might respond, and the model that included no response had been the one she weighted least, on the grounds that Daniel had never in his life accepted a boundary without testing it at least once. What she understood, sitting with the silence of his non-response through the rest of that afternoon and the evening, was that the non-response was not acceptance but calculation, the calculation of a man who understood that the ground had shifted comprehensively, and that what he needed to determine now was not how to reverse it, but what position remained available to him. That was a Daniel she recognized, the one who cut losses with the same precision that he had applied to everything else, without sentiment, and without the self-deception of believing that sentiment was possible when the numbers were clear. She was not, she found, angry at him in the way she might have expected to be. She was tired in the way she was always tired, after she had been carrying something for a long time and had finally been able to put it down, which was not the tiredness of defeat but the tiredness of having been right about the weight. Gregor Fell's organization received the same documentary package that went to the Voss Oversight Committee, delivered through a channel that Vincent's lawyers confirmed was the channel Fell used for similar communications, which meant it arrived in a context that made its implications immediately legible. The Coastal Holdings acquisition did not proceed. The acquisition did not proceed because the acquisition had been predicated on the Voss-Marlow agreement being voided, and the Voss-Marlow agreement was not voided, and the forged document that was meant to void it was now itself documented as a forgery in the same package that had gone to the Oversight Committee, which meant it was not only ineffective as evidence, but was itself evidence of a separate set of problems for the people associated with its production. Fell's organization went quiet in the way that organizations went quiet when they were reassessing their exposure, and that quiet was, for the moment, sufficient. There would be more to do later, but later was not now, and now was what they had. She found him in the library that evening, after dinner, after the lawyers had signed off on the final document package, after the calls had been made and the notifications received, and the specific quality of aftermath had settled into the house. He was not reading. He was sitting in the chair she had come to think of as his, the one by the window that faced the garden, and he was looking at the garden in the way of someone who had arrived somewhere and was not yet sure what to do with the arrival. She came in and sat across from him, and they were in the library in the evening light, the way they had been in the library on the 5th morning, except that it was a different kind of sitting now, the sitting of people who had shared something specific and were on the other side of it. She said, "The Oversight Committee will want a full operational review." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm the best person to conduct it." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I'm telling you because I need to know if that creates a problem for the structure of how this is supposed to work." He looked at her. He said, "What structure?" She said, "The one we have." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "There is no predetermined structure for this. I told you what I believed about what you could do. I have evidence from the past 7 days that confirms what I believed. The structure is what we build from here." She looked at the garden. She said, "I want to ask you something about the door." He looked at her. She said, "When you locked it, the first day, was the lock on the outside or the inside?" He said, "It was a key lock. It could be operated from either side." She said, "Which side were you on when you turned the key?" He was quiet for a moment that was not one of his calculation pauses but something more personal, the pause of someone deciding whether to be precise about something that had not yet been asked precisely before. He said, "I was on the inside." She held that. She said, "And now?" He looked at the door of the library, which was open, had been open all evening, and which led to the hall and the staircase and the west corridor, and eventually, if you knew the route, to the door at the far end that had required a code she did not have. She had the code now. She had been given it on the third day, along with the codes to every other secured area in the house, which was either a practical decision about operational efficiency or something that had not yet been named, and she had filed it the way she filed everything, as information whose full significance would become clear in context. He said, "From the inside, same as now." She looked at the door of the library, and then at him, and then at the garden outside the window where the light was going the way it went in late evenings, gradually, and without particular drama, the day releasing its hold on the sky in the slow and ordinary way that days released their hold. She did not stand up. She did not go to the door. She reached across to the end table and picked up the book she had left there that morning, the one she had been reading without retaining, and she opened it to the page she had marked, and she read, and the library was quiet around them both, and the door was open, and neither of them closed it.